Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a sparkly snowfall card to share with you using North Pole Pals. So let's get started. This is the adorable North Pole Pals stamp set, and I'm actually going to work on my background before I work on the focal point so that I can let it dry while I'm doing my colouring. So I've taken one of the sentiments from the set and I've placed it in the Mini Misty, and I'm going to ink it up using VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. This is a black pigment ink and it does dry fairly quickly, but it's really nice for sentiments because it gives a really nice crisp image. So I'm stamping that down onto a panel of white cardstock. This is 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I am going to stamp the sentiment twice just to make sure that I get a really nice dark impression. And because this is a pigment ink, I do want to set it aside to dry for a couple of minutes. I'm then placing it down onto a sticky mat. This is going to hold it in place while I do my stenciling on top. I'm then taking the heavy snowfall stencil and I'm going to line that up over the panel, and that stencil is going to stick to the sticky mat and hold it in place so nothing's going to shift or anything while I'm doing my pasting. So I'm figuring out here where exactly I want to place the stencil. I want there to be kind of like a line of the snow above where the sentiment is. So I want to try and get kind of like a line that isn't obviously completely straight, but so it has some kind of movement to it, but I don't want it to be too sort of up and down. I want it to be sort of fairly straight but not completely straight. I know that doesn't make any sense, but I'm hoping it does sort of. I'm then going to mask off the bottom of that stencil because I don't want to get any paste on top of my sentiment. So I'm just taking some post-it tape here, ripping that into small pieces so that I can figure out exactly where I want that line of snow to be. I'm then just going to add a bit more memo tape towards the bottom there just to make sure that I don't get any paste towards the bottom of that panel. I'm then taking some Tim Holtz texture paste in Sparkle. This is a translucent paste with glitter particles in. I'm taking some of that on a palette knife and I'm just running that over the stencil. I don't want to get too much on this panel. I don't want it to be like really dimensional. This does dry sort of fairly flat because it's translucent, I think, but it leaves that lovely sparkle behind, and that's kind of what I'm going for here. So I'm just making sure to cover that whole of the area of that stencil there, but I want it to be sort of about the same level as the height of the stencil. So just using my palette knife here to run that over, and I'm just going to try and make it so that it's fairly flat. I don't want too many lines in the paste, but it doesn't really matter if I get some. I don't mind the sort of texture of it, but I want it to be fairly smooth if possible. So I can just remove the excess paste into my jar there, and then just make sure that that's quite nice and flat. And then I can remove the memo tape at the bottom, and then I can lift off that stencil, and it is really well stuck down to that sticky mat, so I'm just being careful here to try and remove it in sort of one swoop. I can then pick up that sticky mat and then I can remove the panel from that as well. And I am going to set that panel aside to dry. It took about half an hour to dry in sort of my climate. I did want to show you that as I was sort of figuring out my design of this card, I did do some little practicing with the background to see what I liked. I did some with kind of ink blending in the background, and I did one with white pigment ink for the snowfall. This one uses that same paste, but I felt that the snow kind of got lost a little bit in the background. So then I did some kind of aqua snow, and I thought that that was really pretty. But ultimately I decided that I quite liked it quite plain and simple with just the snow on the white background, and you kind of get that sparkle from the paste. So I just wanted to show you this is quite a good way to figure out how you want your background to look. I've just done it on some printer paper, so although I'm wasting a little bit of the paste, I'm not wasting any nice cardstock or anything like that, and I can kind of see what I think it's going to look like before I actually do it on my finished card. So now I'm going to work on the images. So I've stamped the polar bear waving and then two of the absolutely adorable penguins down onto some white cardstock using black ink. I'm then going to colour those using Copic markers. So I'm starting off with my darkest shade here for the penguins, and I'm using some blue violet shades. This is my preferred colour palette for penguins. I do sometimes colour them in grey tones, but actually I really love these blue violets. They read as black, but it's just got a little bit of kind of extra zhuzh to them, if that makes sense. I really like using them for penguins. So I'm starting off with my darkest shade, which is BV29, and I'm just mapping out where I want my darkest areas to be. So towards the bottom of his flippers here, and then the sides of his head. And then because that area around the bottom of the body, or kind of like the sides and the bottom of the body, is so tiny, I just went in with that darkest shade. I'm then going in here with the BV25 and I'm blending those areas out a little bit on his head and then also the flippers. And then I'm going in with my lightest shade, which is BV23, and just filling in that area. And then for the white parts of the penguins, I'm using C3. And again, I'm just mapping out where I think my darkest areas would be, kind of like the places that would create some shadow. And then I can blend that out with the C0. And this almost goes completely white, but I am going to go in with the colourless blender just to really blend that out to make sure that I don't get any harsh edges. And then not all penguins have this kind of yellow, but I do like adding it. I think it just adds a little pop of colour. So I used Y11 and then I'm blending that out with the Y000. And then for his feet and his beak, I'm using YR15. And then I can go in with Y15. And they're just tiny little areas, so I didn't need to do too much blending on those. And then I did the other penguin in the exact same way. And then for the bear, ordinarily with polar bears, I tend to go in with the shading being sort of like light brown, sort of beigey colour. But I thought I wanted the colouring to be quite cohesive on this card. So I thought I would go in with the same BV shades that I did for the penguin. So again, I'm mapping out where my darkest areas would be with the BV25. I want this bear to look white, but you always do want to add some shading so that it doesn't look completely flat. And in real life, you would definitely get some darker areas, even if the fur would be white anyway. And then blending that out with the BV23. So just going over the areas that I've already coloured and then bringing that out a little bit. So I definitely want to make sure that I've got some underneath the scarf here to really kind of push that forward. And then just around the side of his head here as well. And not forgetting his ears. And then I can go in with BV20 and really blend that out even further. And I am adding some of this onto the left hand side of his belly as well. So again, going over the areas that I've already coloured and just bringing that colour out even further. And then because again I don't want any harsh edges, I am going to go in with the colourless blender to try and really blend out those edges. And I'm trying not to sort of go over the entire colouring, but sometimes I do think it blends a little bit nicer to do that, especially if you want it to look like it's sort of blending out to white. And I do find that sometimes this doesn't look that nice to start with, but if I leave it to dry completely and let that alcohol completely absorb into the paper and sort of dry off, it does look a lot nicer afterwards. I did go outside of the lines a little bit there, so I'm using that colourless blender just to push that back in as well. And then I lost a little bit of that colour there on his belly or the side of his stomach there. So just going back in with that BV20 and blending that out again. And then for his ears, I'm using RV00. And then for his nose, I'm using the BV29. And then for the scarves on the penguins and the bear, I wanted to use some purple shades. So I'm starting off with V17 and just mapping out again where my darkest areas would be. This isn't my darkest shade, but the V09 that I'm adding on top as my darkest shade is very, very dark. And sometimes I find that I get a little bit of a harsh line if I don't add a base layer in first. So I'm going in with that V09. I can then go back in with the V17 to blend that out. And then I can go in with the V15. So just bringing that colour out a little bit more into the scarf. And then I can finish off with the V12. And then I'm just going to do the same thing for the little scarves on the penguins as well. They are very tiny, so I'm going in with that V17 and then bringing in the V09, but I don't need to go back in with the V17 because the area, like I said, is so tiny. I can just go straight to the V15 and then finish off with the V12. And these penguins are just absolutely adorable. They're so tiny. They're just so, so cute. Once I'd finished the colouring, I'm then taking the coordinating North Pole Pals Die-namics. So I can place the dies over the images and then hold them down with some low tack tape. I'm then going to run those through my die cutting machine and then I can pop out the images on the other side. My panel is now dry, so I'm just taking some scissors and I'm just cutting off any excess paste that's on the outside of that panel, and it cuts off really quite easily. I'm then adding some tape runner adhesive onto the front of my card base. So this is an A2 size white card base, a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I can then place the panel on top, trying to line it up as best as possible. I'm then just going to take a scrap piece of paper, place that over the top and really press that down. I can then add some thin foam tape onto the back of the images. So I'm just cutting that down into small pieces to cover the back of the images completely. I do like using foam tape quite often for this, but you could definitely cut lots of the die cuts separately and kind of stack those one on top of each other to get that dimension as well. So I'm placing my images onto my card before I stick anything down, and then once I'm happy with the placement, I can remove the backings off of that foam tape, and I'm just using some tweezers here just to help me out lifting that backing off. And then I can use some more tweezers to pop the images down. I started off by adhering the two penguins first, so that there was the space on either side of them would kind of be equal, and then I can add the bear in the center. So I'm just placing these down lightly to start with in case I need to move them. So just placing that bear down in the middle. And then once I'm happy with the placement, I can really press those down. And then to finish off, I'm taking a white gel pen and just adding a few highlights onto the scarves of the bear and then also the penguin as well, or the penguins, I should say. These areas are so tiny here on the penguins, but I still wanted to just add that little white highlight. I think it finishes them off quite nicely. And then for the last touch, I'm taking some glaze pen, adding that onto the nose of the bear and then also the beaks of the penguins. And again, these areas are absolutely tiny, so just being careful here with that glaze pen. And it's not kind of too in your face, but it does just add a little bit of sort of sparkle onto those noses and beaks. And so that is the card finished for today. That background is quite subtle, but when it catches the light, it really is very pretty, and it kind of looks like they're in a little bit of a snowstorm. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.